I'm calling Gillian Ginter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on the third reading of the Land Transport Management Amendment Bill. I'd like to start out talking about the cost of transport, because I think it's something that government members probably don't know that much about. So what we know from the regulatory impact statement and from the government books is that central government spends $3 billion a year on transport infrastructure and services. Local government spends $1 to $1.5 billion a year. So altogether, we're talking about $4 to $4.5 billion a year spending on transport from local and central government. Now, of course, that money that they spend comes from New Zealanders. It comes from petrol taxes, from road user charges, and from rates. But of course, a much larger cost is the cost of vehicles and fuel to run them. So our road network doesn't work unless households and businesses have vehicles and have fuel to run those vehicles. Now, New Zealand households and businesses are spending in the order of $12 billion a year on vehicles and fuel to run them. $12 billion a year. So while government is taking our tax money and spending it on transport infrastructure and spending in the order of $4 billion a year, households and businesses are actually having to spend 3 times that much on vehicles and fuel to run them. And of course, all of that contributes to our current account deficit because we don't manufacture vehicles, we don't produce petrol in this country that is used in the tanks of cars. Even if we did find oil off the East Cape, we wouldn't be using it in the tanks of our cars and trucks because we produce light sweet crude here in New Zealand and we export all of it. So anyway, so the total cost of our transport system is more than the amount of taxpayer money that the government is spending on infrastructure. It's the money that households and businesses have to spend on vehicles and fuel to run them because they have no other choice. Because subsequent governments have spent all of the money on infrastructure for vehicles and cars rather than looking at a more cost-effective solution, which would look at what's the best way to move people and goods. What's the most cost-effective way to move people and goods? And what the Green Party is advocating is simply a rational approach to assessing the problem of what is the most cost-effective way to move people and goods. And it turns out that since we have a very extensive road system, the biggest bang for our buck is going to be in improving the productivity of our road system and of our existing rail network. And that means investment in capital expansion of our rail network so that we can deliver better services for our exporters who are using rail freight to get their products to market, and also to invest in passenger transport and safe walking and cycling, because New Zealanders would actually like their kids to be able to walk and cycle to school. They simply don't have the choice. And of course, it's much more cost-effective to provide safe walking and cycling infrastructure than it is to constantly increase the supply of roads for more and more vehicles. Now, we live in an interesting time, because it turns out that the trends of the past 50 years are no longer continuing in the direction that they were going in. So yet another report's come out of the United States. There have been reports from Australia. There have been reports here in New Zealand which show that the fundamental drivers of transport demand are changing. And so what we've seen is absolutely no increase in traffic volumes on state highways since 2004. We've seen no increase in heavy vehicle traffic volumes since 2007. And this is an opportunity that the national government could be seizing to catch up on the lack of investment in alternatives. And that means safe walking and cycling, public transport, rail freight. All of that enables our transport network to work more efficiently. But instead, they have declined to take a rational approach to the assessment of transport infrastructure. And what they've done is, through the government policy statement on transport funding, they have 3 measures by which we're going to define the effectiveness of the projects. One is efficiency, one is strategic fit, and one is effectiveness. Efficiency is the benefit to cost ratio, or BCR. So that's the amount of benefit the project provides, divided by the cost, and that gives you the BCR. And what we've seen is that the vast majority of spending from the national government on transport infrastructure has very low economic efficiency. So the New Zealand Transport Agency has that data available. I've brought it up in the House many times. We've seen the relative benefit of our spending start to decline, and it's actually all very low right now because they're prioritizing projects that don't have very great benefits relative to their costs. But they justify these projects on two other criteria: strategic fit and effectiveness. Now, the strategic fit means, do they fit the strategy as defined by the minister? And the minister has said the strategy is to build the roads of so-called national significance, which are just some pet project motorways, which they think are going to win them votes. So it's a very circular logic, because obviously to meet the strategic fit, when it's defined as building this particular motorway, well, only building the motorway is going to meet that strategic fit. So it's a bit of circular logic there in terms of how the minister has said, we want to build these motorways, never mind that they have very low economic efficiency. We'll say they have high strategic fit because the minister said we had to build them. And then effectiveness is very similar. The effectiveness is how effective the project is at achieving the strategic fit. So we've got two circular logic reasons for justifying projects. We have one which is about economic efficiency, and by that test, the roads of so-called national significance absolutely fail. And unfortunately, we're talking about the single largest bit of spending in the National Infrastructure Plan. So when the national government talks about their plan for lifting our economic competitiveness and productivity, they often refer to investing in productive infrastructure. But about 90% of the money that they're spending on productive infrastructure in the National Infrastructure Plan are these roads of so-called national significance, which have low economic efficiency. So they're spending billions, tens of billions of dollars on projects that have very little benefit relative to their cost. And so there's an opportunity cost. Now, most people don't see the opportunity cost of not spending that $10 billion on projects that would have greater benefits and actually reduce the costs that New Zealand households and businesses are having to spend on transport. So instead of reducing the costs that we're spending on transport by investing the money in a network that works more efficiently, they've decided to spend the vast bulk of the money on new infrastructure on a few projects that will win them votes. There's one other point that I'd like to raise right now, and that's Clause 14 of this bill and what that does. So Clause 14 of this bill takes away the right of regional councils to determine the strategic direction for transport in their area. And in particular, it takes it away from Auckland Council and gives it to Auckland Transport. And Clause 14 says that now the money that the regional councils are spending, or the strategic direction they're setting for transport in their region, has to be consistent with the government policy statement on transport funding. And of course, the government policy statement is written by the minister, who just says, we want to build these projects not because they're economically efficient, not because they're going to deliver benefits for the country, but because we think they're going to win us votes. So what the national government has done with this bill, there are many bad aspects to this bill, is take away the ability of ratepayers, local ratepayers, to determine what their money is going to be spent on. It also takes away the right of Aucklanders to determine what their money is going to be spent on, what transport solutions are going to work best for them. And it puts it all in the hands of the minister, who's riding his GPS on a whim. And ultimately, those roads of so-called national significance in the Waikato, north of Auckland and in Wellington, they aren't going to be used by very many people, and they're certainly not being paid for by the users. If you look at the traffic volumes on these routes, they're much smaller than the average daily traffic volumes on an arterial in Auckland, which, Auckland Council won't even have that much money to spend on upgrading those arterials or investing in productive infrastructure that would mean there were fewer cars on those arterials. So ultimately, what's going on here is the national government is saying to Auckland, We're not going to let you have your regional fuel tax. We're not going to let you fund the solutions that would actually work for your community. We're going to make your rates be spent on our electoral priorities. And we're going to make sure that the fuel taxes of Aucklanders stuck in traffic well into the future are going to pay for some very low-value motorways. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call Mike Sabin.
Thank you, sir. I'm